2014 Bill Russell NBA Finals Most Valuable Player Award. Please welcome ABC's Stuart Scott.
Thank you very much.
On July 18th, 2018, the Spurs sent their best player to Toronto for scraps. 5 years earlier, they were the gold standard. 5 titles, a culture other leagues studied, and a system so rigid it became a cage. The same discipline that built a dynasty made the front office incapable of bending. Local ratings collapsed 74%, revenue rank fell to 21st, and bootleg merchandise stole $13.6 million a year. The numbers are brutal, but the lesson is what every sports business needs to hear. To understand the fall, you have to see how high they were flying. In 2014, the Spurs were playing basketball so beautiful that coaches in other sports called it art. They had 5 championships, 22 straight playoff appearances, and a front office that never panicked. Popovich's system did more than win games. It built an organization so stable that NFL and MLB executives flew to San Antonio to study how they did it. The model was simple: draft smart, develop patiently, and never let any one player become bigger than the team. They found Tony Parker late in the first round and Manu Ginobili at the very end of the draft, then turned both into Hall of Famers. Tim Duncan anchored everything with a humility that kept the whole machine running smoothly. That culture became their brand. Sponsors paid for stability, local businesses bought season tickets because the product was predictable, and national TV networks scheduled Spurs games knowing the ratings would hold. It was the most efficient small market operation in American sports. Popovich and the Holt family had built something so admired that other franchises copied their blueprint. The problem was that the handbook never got a second edition. The same walls that kept distractions out also kept new ideas from getting in. Meanwhile, the three-point revolution rewrote basketball. Player empowerment reshaped contracts, and super teams started dictating where stars landed. When the NBA changed, the Spurs were still reading from page 1. The crack showed up in 2017. Kawhi Leonard, the 2014 Finals MVP and the obvious heir to Duncan, suffered a quad injury that should have been routine. But what happened next had nothing to do with medicine. Trust was the real issue. The Spurs medical staff cleared him to play. Leonard's camp disagreed, got second opinions, and he stayed away from the team for months. The organization that preached family and trust suddenly looked like an institution that trusted its own process more than its best player's body. By the summer of 2018, the relationship was shattered beyond repair. The same medical staff that had earned trust for decades suddenly became the symbol of everything that had gone wrong. On July 18, 2018, the Spurs traded Leonard and Danny Green to Toronto for DeMar DeRozan, Jakob Poeltl, and a protected first-round pick. The math was devastating. San Antonio could have offered Leonard a 5-year supermax worth around $219 million. Instead, they shipped a top 5 player out the door for a package that kept them respectable, but never turned them into a threat again. DeRozan was a 4-time All-Star and a solid professional, but he wasn't Kawhi, and everyone knew it. The trade wasn't just a basketball mistake. It was a signal that the Spurs' way couldn't bend far enough to keep its most valuable asset happy. And the real cost wouldn't appear on the trade sheet. It would surface in the spreadsheets 3 years later, long after the headlines had moved on. By 2022, the damage was measurable in dollars and eyeballs. According to Sports Business Daily, Spurs' local TV ratings had dropped 74% since the 2015-16 peak. In 2019 alone, they plunged another 34% in a single season. A franchise that used to command national attention was becoming invisible in its own market. The revenue rankings told the same story. By 2024-25, the Spurs sat at 21st in the NBA in revenue with $353 million. The Warriors, running a star-driven model in a bigger market, generated roughly $800 million in the same season. San Antonio wasn't poor, but they were being lapped by the very teams they used to outperform with discipline. The gap wasn't just embarrassing, it was a warning that star power drives revenue more than organizational consistency ever ever could. Gate receipts hovered around $78 million in 2024, which meant a loyal fan base kept showing up, mostly out of habit. The real bleed was in the intangibles. Bootleg Spurs gear was costing the team $13.6 million a year in lost licensing revenue, the sixth highest counterfeit loss in the entire league. When your brand is strong, fans buy real jerseys. When your brand fades, they buy fakes, and you never see that money. The numbers didn't lie. Losing one superstar didn't just hurt the win column, it cratered the business. The numbers were symptoms of a disease that ran deeper. The Spurs way had always been built on one simple rule: we over me, which meant team success always came before individual status. Popovich enforced that code with a toughness that other organizations envied. But by 2017, the rest of the league had shifted. Player empowerment wasn't a passing trend. It had become the actual business model that stars used to control their own careers. Stars controlled their own brands, their own medical teams, and their own destinies. The Spurs saw that shift as a threat instead of an opportunity. When Leonard's camp wanted outside medical opinions, the organization treated it like a betrayal of trust, rather than a reasonable request from a young man protecting his career. The Spurs had built their empire on loyalty and sacrifice, and they expected Leonard to follow the same script that Duncan and Parker had followed before him. But Kawhi wasn't Tim Duncan, and 2018 wasn't 2003. LaMarcus Aldridge had joined in 2015, seeking the system and the titles, but his tenure ended in a 2021 buyout after injuries and illness wore him down. The Spurs couldn't reload around a new core because they never played the superstar free agency game the way Miami or Golden State did. They waited for the next Duncan to fall into their lap, but generational talents don't arrive on schedule. The medical dispute with Kawhi was never really about medicine, it was about control. The system that built 5 titles couldn't adjust to a world where the best players demanded a voice. Popovich and the front office had been right for so long that they stopped asking if they were still right. Other small market teams faced the same pressures, but they chose to evolve instead of standing still. Take Oklahoma City, where Sam Presti built a war chest of draft picks, moved aggressively when opportunities opened, and constructed a contender around young stars without abandoning development culture. The Thunder proved you could keep the process and still play the modern game. They traded for Paul George when the window opened, flipped him for more assets when he left, and never let culture become an excuse for standing still. Denver did it differently, but just as effectively. They developed Nikola Jokic patiently, added smart complementary pieces, and won a championship without surrendering their identity or their financial discipline. The Nuggets showed that development purity can still win when you pair it with star retention and roster flexibility. Even the Warriors, operating in a massive market, mixed star power with organizational culture to become a revenue juggernaut. The difference between San Antonio and these teams wasn't market size at all. It was simply willingness. The Spurs clung to a playbook that worked in 2005, while the rest of the league rewrote the rules for 2020. Then Victor Wembanyama arrived, and suddenly the Spurs had a reason for the cameras to show up again. His jersey finished 6th in NBA sales during his rookie season, despite the team losing games. Local viewership jumped 54% in 1 year. The Spurs were suddenly relevant again, not because the system changed, but because a generational talent forced the market to pay attention. In 2026, San Antonio reached the NBA Finals. The playoff run generated an estimated $36.2 million for the local economy. In the finals alone, against the Knicks, pulled 20.6 million viewers per game, the most watched championship series since 1998. Star equity still drives everything in this league, and the 2026 finals proved it to a generation of executives who had forgotten. But one central question still hangs over the organization, and nobody knows the answer yet. Nobody knows whether the Spurs actually changed their system, or whether a once-in-a-generation player simply forced them to bend. The lesson from the dark years isn't that culture is worthless. Culture is what built the 5 titles in the first place. The lesson is that culture is a tool, not a suicide pact. Build unbreakable systems, but treat your best assets like the irreplaceable revenue engines they are. Because when culture becomes rigidity, the numbers don't lie, the fans don't come back, and neither does the balance sheet. If you want to see how the Thunder built the modern small market playbook, Watch this next. Subscribe for more sports business breakdowns.